Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine tagmatic cavalry between roughly the 8th and the 10th century. This video is going to be focused on their equipment. Mostly we will see how we will actually repeat much of what I've been talking about relatively to the Byzantine cataphracts in other two videos I made. Just trying, however, this time to stress the difference that we didn't talk about last time between the so-called tagmatic troops and the thematic ones, and trying to look at this unit, the tagmata, that were essentially the first of all the core of the imperial forces proper. They were created in the 8th century, the time of Constantine V. Then they were eventually reorganized, or better, simply there were certain additions. Obviously, the key of starting this period is, unfortunately, that we don't know that much. We don't really know how these military units were practically organized. We know fairly a lot considering the times, but we still lack some important things. For instance, number strength. Aside from the fact that these units remain there for centuries, but in part, and obviously there were certain changes, certain internal reorganizations, but we even lack about a simple sheer knowledge about their numerical strength. Sometimes we have certain sources that state numbers that usually are too high. Sometimes we know more from the Arab sources than from the Byzantine ones, just in the case of the tagmata, etc. So, giving a bit of background, basically, were the tagmata. So first of all, a bit of language here. The tagmata is the plural of the of tagma in Greek. That's as simple. It's like with thema and themata. It's the singular and the plural respectively. And this was a military organization that essentially was conceived to have the tagma corresponded organically to roughly a modern battalion or regiment size. I think in the modern Greek military there is even a correspondent to that, I think. So these were essentially elite units. They were professional. We can say permanent troops in a certain measure, although it's a bit more complicated. These units were probably, and that's why partly even the logics of how many they were kind of, it's not really that important, although there is a lot of debate behind that, because these basically were troops that were stationed around the capital. So there were, we can think at all times, certain battle-ready tagmata that were out there to intervene at in every situation, partly because the tagmata also made up the Imperial Guard, even in the Imperial Palace and all, but there were actually several different units that we can maybe list afterwards, and these were but the rest were basically scattered a bit around the capital. Part of these soldiers were actually part of the same Constantinopolitan milieu, or also from Asia Minor, that was growing at the time as the military core, let's say the military point of gravity, center of gravity of the empire. And these units had been created by Emperor Constantine V to essentially put an end to the thematic rebellions, that is, the rebellions of the tagmatic armies. Now, what were the tagmatic armies, and why were the tagmatic ones different? Well, essentially, the Byzantine Empire, or Roman Empire, as more it would be probably the case to call him. It would be really the case to call him like that, but just to I use the word Byzantine just to make you understand what I'm talking about. By the way, the word tagma is witnessed in in use in the Roman army since like the 4th century. Mm. You know that obviously there was eventually this shift, even linguistically speaking. I mean, even when the only the eastern part of the empire, say, survived, the official language of the army was still Latin, in spite of, you know, in the eastern half of the empire, the prevalent language was Greek, at least. Historically speaking, it was more widespread and all. Then eventually it kind of Hellenized in language because of obvious reasons. But even if, especially in the military in the military vocabulary, you find sometimes in Greek certain words that were actually the Hellenization of Latin terms. That is also fascinating because it tells you how deeply rooted this properly Roman identity really was. I mean, the Byzantines didn't consider themselves as Greeks even at later. They considered themselves as Romans, and that was the real point, because Rome, being a Roman, is something meta-historical, something meta-ethnical in a certain sense. It's really about the empire, and it doesn't matter where you come from or which language you speak, as long as you are a Roman. In that case, also that you were a Christian, because basically that was not just a Christian empire at that point, but the Christian empire. So the ecumenical, it was considered as the ecumenical empire in the first place, even if it had shrunk so consistently, and that's where the thematic organization of the empire stemmed from, because basically in by the 60s of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire shrunk to less than 1/2 of its territorial extension because of the Arab invasion that came to threaten the same Constantinople at one point, beginning of the 8th century, and the idea is that not just this the territory of the empire was resized, and by the way, some of the wealthiest regions of the empire that were the ones of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine were wiped out. So this created lots of problems also in terms of logistics, of supplies. Constantinople shifted in this sense its supplies dependency from Egypt substantially to the Black Sea, to the Ukraine. So it was a bit of and it was also a big deal of, let's say, of more direct, let's say, a transformation, let's say, that brought to the local areas to actually provide more directly those resources. Because if you have a large empire, you are essentially, you do such things. I mean, to rely on several parts, several provinces of the empire in order to get this or that. Then if you lose them, you have to recompact on a more local base. But there were certain regions of the empire that were still very far. Take Italy, for instance, or other regions that maybe were even very close to Constantinople in some cases, but that had a very few ties with that for social and economical dynamics. So since let's say the pillar of the empire in terms of institutions of administration had been this centralized system that costed a freaking lot, now there weren't the resources anymore to maintain that. So as in many other times in history, the general solution is to decentralize and to say, okay, you are, I don't know, you're there far away. Say Italy, because Italy was the very, very decentralized in this sense, and I don't know, if you want to govern in there, you can basically, we won't send you the army anymore from Constantinople because we don't have any source anymore, but we allow you to basically recruit your own army in locally speaking. So one of the consequences of this, and this happened actually, and that was what the thema was about, the singular military and administrative division of the empire. I stress here on the military side because the military is, was posed the greatest expense, was the most expensive thing of the Roman state in absolute terms at the time. The greatest expense of any political entity was the military. So administration in this sense existed chiefly because of maintaining an efficient military organization, even before than justice, for instance, because justice in great part was also subordinated to the deterrent effect that the same armed forces posed. You have to think we are in the early Middle Ages, and so even in such a, let's say, a centralized state like the Roman one, there was still a big deal of, let's say, of political fragmentation. Lots of local aristocracies did it whatever they wanted, and in this thematic organization, it was actually the unique, say, the unique thing, the sole thing to do to solve the problem. But at the same time, it produced others that couldn't be avoided. That is, in fact, the progressive fragmentation of the empire into all these various themata that all had a center of power, their own provincial army, and that could, in this sense, even be opposed to what was, I mean, to the local, say, to the current emperor, for instance, and to create revolts, maybe to seize the throne, as and that was a hell of a problem. So since the from the 8th century, you know probably that in Europe, both in the West and in the East, there was an economical revival that is considered to be the beginning of this, say, the end of the so-called Dark Ages that never existed as such, but definitely were moments of economical contraction, of political instability and all, and very progressively a sort of rise once again. So what happens in the Byzantine Empire is that the Constantinopolitan emperors start to have more resources available. Constantinople, in this sense, worked as a big, solid infrastructure in many ways, also from a military point of view. You can argue that in later times, basically, Constantinople manages to reaffirm its authority all over the themata, at least more than what existed before, and therefore to centralize increasingly the organization of even of the armed forces. And although the themata were not disbanded, the tagmata were created, and these were a different form of organization that, as we were saying, revolved around the capital, and from which the emperors could recruit faithful troops, as we've said, professionals, mercenaries, if you want. There's not a big difference in this sense. By the way, there were also a lot of foreigners among these troops, in part. Here we can go at the... and the interesting thing about... Excuse me, I drink a little. The big... excuse me. The big thing about that is very meaningful about these times is that the tagmata were chiefly cavalry units, or better. In numerical terms, actually, cavalry was probably the minority, but it was the core and the backbone, we can say, of the tagmata. In fact, the tagmata are usually remembered as this essentially cavalry force, not just a cavalry force, but a heavy cavalry force. This stemmed essentially from two reasons, mainly, that are intertwined, by the way. The first one is that the Byzantine Empire was very large. And since, as we have seen, one of the major concerns of the Roman emperors was control all the various, let's say, the periphery of the empire, having a mounted contingent, a mounted army, was a way also to go faster. I know it sounds banal, but it basically allowed to go back and forth, say, from the various corners of the empire. Also because at that time there were definitely certain needs for that. Think of all the wars fought against the Arabs. All the offenses, the empire was under siege in many ways. So time was vital, and having an efficient, combat-ready cavalry force was definitely the best answer to meet multiple threats all over the frontiers at the same time. The second reason is a bit more cultural and social. That is that cavalry, just like in the West, was rising also in the Byzantine Empire as the main tactical, let's say, the determining tactical arm. So sometimes we like to stress that the West and the East were that different, but actually if you look at the history of Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, you realize that they really had pretty much actually a lot in common, and that there were lots of intersections, a lot of influences, and especially that these two parts were not opposed or isolated, even when they fought against each other, but on the contrary, they had a lot of contacts, so that there is also a lot of influences in terms of military. I can't say military organization, but there was first of all a society that was, although very different, kind of going in the same direction in part. So the increase of the importance of cavalry at this time. These tagmatic forces were established essentially in the same time between the Carolingians and the Ottonians. So yeah, we are between the 8th and the 11th century, so it's exactly that. And you see in the West that there is a sharp rise in heavy cavalry, and that's the same in the Byzantine Empire. So that shift from, say, from infantry to cavalry in terms of tactical advantage that characterizes the High Middle Ages is taking place also in the Byzantine Empire. I'm approximating, but it's important to make you understand it. And roughly what I'm referring to, and the Byzantines in this sense were kind of they were different from the West because they didn't really have a very feudal organization like the one in the West was being formed. Because the Byzantine Empire still remained as a state, so even when in later times the pronoia system was invented, that is often described as a sort of feudal system, but actually the state, Constantinople, had still this very strong central authority that could in part claim back those lands that were entrusted to certain noblemen to create their own military retinues, whereas in the West there was no central authority, so basically the privatization of the empire definitely was occurring. So that's the main thing. But the Byzantines had another influence that actually pushed them to use cavalry extensively. That is a bit of its essentially the peoples Constantinople was bordering with. At this time were partly still the Avars before Charlemagne actually destroyed them, then the Hungars, we're talking about the Danubian frontier, then all these peoples that later came in, the Cumans, etc., that had the Pechenegs before. So Constantinople was pretty close to this steppes world that, even from the east, from Persia, was still pretty influent in terms of heavy cavalry and mounted units. So we can say that Constantinople, and you can see that from essentially from their military technology, that they had a big deal of equipment, of tactics that actually were pretty let's say evidently, I can't say just influenced, but they responded to the same tactical problems that such steppes people sometimes had. So, because the Byzantine cavalry at this time was a very, very skilled one, very, very good one, and the tagmata in this sense embodied probably definitely some of the best and most and elitary troops of the time, units of the time. And so here I can say I wanted to talk about equipment today, but I'm ending up to make a story of the organization. I will make a dedicated video to that, and I would just like to mention the name of the tagmata proper. That is the various battalions essentially that were made up. The scholae, that is the schools, is something that dated back from the scholae palatine that were created by Constantine the Great back in the day. Sometimes, by the way, these names can be very sometimes the scholae are a term that were used for the word tagmata sometimes. So it's very complicated to even understand what their practical function and distinctions were. Then another tagma was the excubitoi, from the ancient excubitores in Latin. That is the sentinels, established by Leo I. The arithmos, or vigla. That is, these are all terms in part that come. You see here, there is the Greek term, but there is also the Latin one, or sometimes the Latin term comes from other Latin names. This was established instead by the Empress Irene in the 80s of the 8th century. So we are roughly at the same time of Charlemagne. So it's interesting how these new units are reformed alongside what was probably also happening in the West in some part. The empire was re-expanding, just like in the West, the Carolingian one was re-expanding. So there were certain intersections also in terms of Irene was about to get married with Charlemagne. So it's kind of interesting because it tells you how these populations actually were in pretty close contact with. And there are reflections in the military organization that the ikanatoi, that is the able ones established by Nicephorus I. Then other units were the numeroi, from the Latin numerus, the number. These were these units of allies, originally speaking, in the Roman army. These were actually not new, even as a Byzantine unit. Probably, and I think that this is the place where there were more foreigners actually in this place. At this time, the Byzantine Empire was pretty open was pretty inclusive in terms of military thing. I mean, in these centuries, the Byzantines increasingly enroll an increasing number of foreign troops. By the 11th century, there was plenty of Western knights in the Byzantine army, in part as mercenaries, but that's how sometimes mercenaries could be even better, more convenient than a permanent force. And actually, even if you think about the Varangian Guard and all, sometimes foreigners are paradoxically a bit more faithful to the central authority than the local nobility. That kind of makes sense, and that's what the reason why, I don't know, the Islamic caliphs had Christian guards, or why Frederick II had the Saracens in his. I mean, that's where the thing, because they were actually dependent from that authority, so it wasn't their interest to interfere with it. And then the optimatoi, that is from optimates in Latin, that is the best. The optimates were also, socially speaking, they weren't just a military unit. Historically, there was this social class of the best, of the lustres in Latin sometimes. So this, and it kind of gives the elite nature of this dogma. And I would like to say more, but now I don't have time. Seemingly, there were even certain navy units of the empire that were counted as tagmata. etc. Then there were even these special bodyguard of the emperor, the Aetairae, it is the companions, just like it's a term that was used in the East, just like the bodyguards of Alexander the Great. Relatively to the size, we don't really know how much they were. We think they might have the numbers of the tagmata might have varied between the 8th and the 11th century, between, I don't know, 1,000 to even 40,000 troops. Probably we might think that I think that the average thing was that for every tagma there could be at a certain point like 4,000 troops, which is pretty much a lot. I mean, the tendency seems to have been to increase in time, in numbers, like many other units that happen. Yeah, last time I was talking about. I mean, there are many units in history that are created as sort of an elite for central power that at a certain point, however, kind of substitute the whole army and start to expand in size, and even to lose partly its kind of it's obviously its elite nature and kind of functioning as a whole army. So with all the various components of various level of quality. And this is seemingly what's been in case of the tagmata. So passing to the equipment of the tagmata. So we have said before they were chiefly cavalry. There was also infantry, we know that, but not in very big number. I mean, there were more than cavalrymen, as always, also because you have to think that the cavalrymen were obviously needing assistants, squires, so that they were usually inservients of lower status, and as you see, as you can see sometimes even in the West, the whole evolution sometimes went on. Actually, the squires were mounted as well, could be mounted as well, but some could just. I mean, you need an infantry force even for cavalry to act jointly with. You can't really say, okay, cavalry can do the whole thing. Also because this is not, I mean, at this time cavalry starts getting prevalent as the decisive factor in battles, but not quite enough to be left alone in the field. Infantry up to the, say, roughly the 12th, 13th century is still the 12th century is still there as a sort of, at least of support for cavalry, and even partly kind of withstanding the cavalry attacks. Then the 13th century is the moment of which cavalry kind of takes the lead, and actually just in the 14th century it starts losing it again. But let's say that into these times between the 8th and the 10th century, well, infantry is still, and Byzantine infantry, we know it was pretty advanced, pretty well trained, sophisticated. I mean, Byzantines had great military organization really at this time. So why do I want to talk about the equipment? Well, because I can spot many things that I think are interesting relatively to how these units fought, and we're talking now chiefly about cavalry, exclusively about cavalry, practically. So now we'll be a bit schematic, but just think that this is never a a fixed thing. I mean, there was a huge deal of fluidity, of flexibility, also in terms of how these people could fight, how they could be equipped, cavalry could dismount, etc. Just, however, think that here the Byzantine army was something that was beginning also to stress the role of elite cavalry as something that had basically to have that specific tactical role. And the Byzantines at this time were masters of combined arms cavalry tactics, aside from the infantry ones as well. So the main organization of these troops actually seem to have been, from a tactical point of view, to be divided in five ranks. So the whole tagmatic cavalry was deployed in 5 ranks, seemingly 1, 2, and 5 being melee cavalry, that is lancers, while 3 and 4 archers. Now this is interesting because you realize, first of all, archers, and considering the ranks in a whole of a similar, at least numerical size, were 40%. And you might say, well, that's a few. Well, really, I think it's interesting because thinking about, say, for instance, the German cavalry at this time, the one of the Ottonians, were mostly lancers, if not only lancers, but we're still fighting against populations like, say, the Hungars, the Magyars, who were predominantly mounted archers. So what is interesting about the Byzantine army at this point, it was a Western army in the sense that, I mean, it wasn't, it was part of the European sedentary world, etc., with the state and all. Is that it partly had integrated this horse archers. That is something that you rarely find in the West. I mean, every Western nobleman at the time was able to use arrows and bows on horseback, but that's because he went hunting all the time, and not because he really preferred to fight like that. The Westerners prefer to have this shock force of cavalry, of lancers charging, and that's it. The Byzantines instead remained a bit more Eastern-minded in this sense, or they were influenced, as we have seen, also for the nature of the enemies they were facing, to be more flexible, to maintain this ancient tradition of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, to include horse archers into their cavalry ranks. So this is very important because even considering how the ranks here were deployed, you had a first rank of lancers, first 2 ranks of lancers, then 2 ranks of archers, and then a last lancers rank. So this is interesting because it's an invitation to combine tactics. Here you probably, I mean, this is purely ideal. I mean, I don't really know personally whether this was this tactic, this deployment was used all the times. Evidently it wasn't, because in every tactical situation you have to invent something new. But the fact that this idea of first charge, maybe to try to break the enemy ranks, then with horse archers that can soften up the already fatigued enemy, and then the last lancers charge that can disrupt finally the enemy formation, it kind of makes sense. It reminds pretty much the cavalry tactics that the Byzantines were masters of since centuries in their campaigns in the east against enemies that in this sense made also extensive use of such sophisticated cavalry tactics. So the main weapon as a lance was the so-called contarion. So it derived from the contos, essentially. It was this very it was actually the Contarians, if I understood it well, was rather slender, originally speaking. It was a 12-foot lance, and it was so long. Sometimes it was still called contos. That is the barge pole, considering its length. So a very long length that suggests definitely the I mean, when you have such long lances, you really understand that let's say the collective effort of these formations was pretty high, because as long as you have a short lance that you can use both as a javelin or as a lance or as a spear in a very dynamic way, tells probably that individually speaking you're a very good fighter, but it doesn't tell that good about the whole collective quality of the formation, while such long lances means that this cavalry was so specialized into charging information that really that this very long lengths was essentially developed for. That is something that is so long that basically you can't use but with that aim. Also because it's also something. I mean, the longer the length is, the more it's cumbersome, the more it requires training. So that was conceived in this fashion, and that tells that these tagmatic units were really the spearhead of the army. They were the ones that were sent probably into battle. Preferably if there were other thematic units, for instance, around, just at last, as the elite shock reserve that had to give the last blow to the enemy. There were lots of cataphracts, as a matter of fact. We're talking chiefly about heavy cavalry here. There wasn't probably that segmentation that usually existed in the rest of the cavalry, that is a few armored guys and then lighter troops. Here seemingly the tagmatic cavalry was chiefly cataphract, at least at the beginning, as an elite unit. That was its main function. Then probably in later centuries it kind of got segmented as well in this fashion, but between the 8th and the 10th century probably was a very elite troop with a very heavy armor in part. So these were almost cataphracts, when not cataphracts de facto. The other weapons were dagger, a sword, obviously carried from a baldric, and the sword could be 3 feet long, so not short, not very short. And this also is interesting because the sword is well, I don't want to get too far into this, but let's say that it's not an extent. Say in Byzantine cavalry, it's not as universal as in Western cavalry. I mean, it was still there. Obviously, the function of the weapon was always the same. Byzantine cavalry made extensive use of swords, but let's say that at least the impression I got is that the Byzantines were so much more, say, specialized from a tactical point of view, that sometimes a certain type of cavalry was kind of wasted into melee. It had just maybe to do a charge straight ahead, or maybe it was better off with a mace rather than a sword. I discussed about this in my videos about the Byzantine cataphracts, especially the Nicephorian cataphracts at the time of Nicephorus II, because actually we have evidence that the sword could be used, but it wasn't that preferred. So it's interesting in here, but by the way, the sword was issued, at least, because I'm mainly discussing this from military manuals, because the iconographic sources are a bit more a bit different. I can't say that they're less realistic, but at least they show us a bit of a different thing. And in this sense, the manuals are a bit more reliable, because the iconographic thing could be just sort of an artistic depiction. Also, the manuals aren't truth of what it was. These manuals sometimes were quite theoretical as well. So, unfortunately, we will never know practically how these soldiers were really like, but we kind of have a broad idea of what it could be. Also, the dagger is nice because the dagger for a cavalryman is essentially conceived to engage into a very physical combat. You know, the dagger, you have just to jump over the enemy, physically speaking, to embrace them, to stuck the dagger into, you know, the parts of the unarmored parts, I don't know, the necks, armpits, stuff like that. So it basically, this is also an interesting indicator. I mean, daggers were definitely used also by lighter cavalry, but in this sense they reveal a much more dynamic combat than just, in this sense, the simple charge, and maybe the Contrarian could express. So these troops were also probably quite versatile and capable of fighting in many different factions, even though their elite units would make them preferable chiefly as a shock charge use for shock charge use. And passing to the shield, I think the shield is quite interesting here because of its dimensions. Basically, it seems that in these times, the Byzantine shields, cavalry shields at least, had gone enlarging. From previous times, from the time of the Strategicon, say the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, probably mostly second half of the 6th. And this is important for us because the Byzantines also had their own moment of, say, of Dark Age in the 7th century. Dark Age is a term you can use correctly only if you stress the fact that we have less sources from that period, because these weren't dark ages in spite of all these dramatic things that might have happened. It's a kind of an ideological statement to call an age dark. It's ugly, say. But one of the consequences of this darkness is indeed that we don't have enough sources. So we know that from the 6th century army, that was essentially the evolution from the late imperial, the late antique one. It was still part of the late antique army in practice. There is a moment of crisis, of this moment of general reorganization of the empire, all the problems because of the Arab invasions, into which the world statal organization kind of jumped in some part, in part, and with the obvious consequences also in the military organization. So sometimes we see that only from these later centuries, the 8th and the 9th century, we start knowing something more consistent about the Byzantine army. And what we notice is that the shields, cavalry shields, have enlarged. According to Leo VI, Leo the Wise, that was definitely expert about military affairs, shields were a maximum of 1 meter or a little more in length, and which is basically the same size of the 11th century Kite Shield that you find also in Normans and all. And the Silogate instead, there is another source of the time, and it's called Siloge, actually, Tacticorum, because it's in Latin. This is a text that was written in the 10th century. It talks about tactics indeed, and it influenced also later sources like the Praecepta Militaria by Nicephorus II, and this is interesting because you realize how the Byzantines had this treatise tradition that they were quite keen on military affairs, and how they tried to systemize these conceptions. It really equated to the intellectual superiority of the Byzantine world because of his classical legacy and all. To kind of even rationalize and to understand even the enemies, that this is a very important thing. At this time, the Byzantine Empire, in this sense, was still very intellectually dynamic, and knew how to reflect on itself and to better itself as an armed force accordingly to withstand the enemy attacks and all. So that's also part of the reason why the Byzantine army was so cool at this time, because you can read these treatises and understand so much. So the Silage describes a three-cornered infantry shield, Also here they are clearly kite shields, and yes, they were used also on foot, just like you see in the West. Kite shields, aside from the fact that usually cavalry could dismount and fight on foot, but that was pretty much the universal shield form also in, at least from this point onwards, because usually the migration the migration era shield was a round thing. And actually the round shield is seemingly has been the progenitor of the kite shield, of the drop shaped. It kind of evolved from there. We think especially in the West there might have been Byzantine influences, so this was probably the base for later European version, because seemingly these shields as a typology seem to have originated in the Byzantine Empire. Then we find it later into the Anatolian manuscript, not very so distant in times. I personally believe that similar equipment, military equipment, can be developed in multiple places at once in parallel. But thinking about how Europe was already so deeply intertwined at this time, probably it was both things. Both a practical need could be solved locally without any external influence, but also some external influence, like, let's see what other people have done at this point in Europe, and let's kind of fix our problems accordingly. So this is interesting in terms of development of military technology. And by the way, the shields of the Silage seem to have been even larger, let's say longer, even a meter and 40, something like that. So these weren't small shields, actually. They were pretty large, and in fact we know that from pictorial sources especially, we have this idea that these shields could be up to 2 feet broad at their widest point. So they could vary in size. Here in the picture, the background picture, I haven't placed a guy with a shield. It's just an archer that could wear a shield, by the way, as well, telling the truth. But even this kite shield could be even more or less squared, more or less thinner. I mean, it really depends. We don't have all this great certainty about how it was. It's just the shape, generally speaking, is conceived, especially for, I mean, it's an anatomic need. I mean, this shield, as always, had to protect chiefly the chest, and for cavalry, having kite shield was useful because it protected your chest, but at the same time, from one side it went down like a drop, in fact, and took over part of your, even of your up to your thighs. And that this is interesting because, by the way, these guys seemingly were quite heavily armored. So generally speaking, the shields are smaller proportional to the degree of protection you're wearing in armor. So that's the reason why, I don't know, in 15th century Europe you have plate armor everywhere, and if you're wearing plate armor, you're not using a shield, or at least you're using a very small one. And because also the shield is something cumbersome, it weighs. You have to think that everything that you have on yourself into combat, it's something that's going to destroy you physically, to keep there continuously and to fight with. So these guys were already very much covered in iron, in a lot of other materials, and the shield was definitely it could be useful, definitely, but it kind of stressed you even more, physically speaking, for physical exertions and all. But at this point, at least for this level of armor, we see that the shield was pretty much used, and this is what we can see, obviously, also in the West. So it was still a life-saving thing in great part, especially uh, for Malay troops. The interesting thing, though, as we've seen, that the tagmatic cavalry was made up also of archers, and Leo actually specifies that the uh, that a smaller shield was also to be carried. We're talking about essentially, Leo is stating a sort of 30 centimeters of diameter shield, so it's like a sort of buckler in practice. Even though we have our sources actually showing us shields that could be even double size or even more, like from 60 to 80 centimeters of diameter. And these were probably mostly used by the tagmatic archers. I mean, it would be normal. Here we have a tagmatic archers in the background picture. Here it doesn't show it, but just imagine here on the guy's left arm or arm, that is, by the way, the one that you see is more exposed because it's sticking out, externally speaking. So it's the one you may wanna. This guy is not in combat. Evidently, he is. He's training. He's practicing. But he would have worn here on the external side of his arm, left arm, a round shield to protect the arm, externally speaking. That was pretty widespread as a shield in all the steppes peoples, essentially, or even the Arabs, the Turks. This time the Byzantines were fighting, wore such shields, so it doesn't make sense to think that this wasn't used, and it was pretty much the norm, because it was a relatively light but important thing, because you don't want to have your arm pierced by an arrow, to be cut off, and so it's still very important. So there are also other informations we have, for instance, about how the Contarion was actually carried, because we have seen that these guys were pretty dynamic in terms of combat capabilities, and there might have been situations, actually most of the times, to which their long lance was not of use, but also actually also pretty cumbersome for them to use. So seemingly the Byzantines could slang their Contarion behind their back with a strap, and this seemingly was another feature that they had essentially taken from that horse riding people. And this was useful because you could have your arms kind of free to use other weapons. And by the way, the Contarion was also brought together with the baggage, with the rest of that. And this is interesting because it's a bit like in the Western world, in the Western chivalry. You had your own extra, your spare lances that were they usually went broken during the charges, because you have to think of the forces being physically exercised in these charges were definitely extremely violent, so it was the norm for your lance to be broken. So these guys probably also they had their own assistants like squires and all that between a charge and another brought a new Contarion to their cavalrymen. So the Contarion was used really just like it's the norm in any cavalry in the worst say in all the possible ways. It could be used overarm with an overarm grip, or in a two-handed fashion. That is very interesting because the two-handed grip is really it's something that comes from the steppes. So it's the idea that, oh, by the way, you're not the horse is kind of running alone. Um, these horses were probably so well trained that they could simply respond to the knight's orders with a sign, and so holding the Kontarian with two hands would make you not taking the reins, or maybe you could in part, but it was still a bit complicated to maneuver the horse if the animal hadn't already known how to go there. If I think the horses were trained together with the cavalrymen, so there were special breeds that were particularly obedient and easily trained, and they also had to have a cold blood in part. Although the most common grip, at least the ones shown in sources, is the one in one hand. And towards the late 10th century, we start seeing essentially what starts happening partly also into the Western world. That is, there was a sort of couché grip. There is a lot of debate even for the Western chivalry where it began for this grip to be used, because seemingly the Byzantines had at this point they had also certain devices like the later a sort of Lanx rest. You know that the rest is introduced properly. I mean the one we call it in West, also say in the low Middle Ages, if not late, when the Lanx had grown so much in size and weight that it couldn't be really carried in another fashion, but with a rest. So that is essentially something you place the Lanx on to sustain its weight. But seemingly something was experimented also before, and seemingly the Byzantines were also using parts of these devices already. You have to think that there is all a world of cavalry we don't really know much about those days, including how could... I mean, the whole problem... at this point the stirrup was in use, pretty widespread. It was spreading, telling truth, already, but... especially the Byzantines, because of their eastern contacts, let's say, were pretty eagerly into this, and their cavalry was very advanced. It's not really but one of the problems that the stirrup poses is, if you don't it's not that the cavalry improved because of the stirrup, it's the other way around. I mean, the cavalry improved to require stirrup. And yet, we know of cavalries, historically speaking, that charged both hand with a two-handed grip on their legs without stirrup. That is something incredible, because basically that kind of grip is conceived for impact, often against other cavalry. And in fact, we know for instance, from 6th century sources that there were a lot of people falling because the stirrup wasn't there, or maybe it was there but there were more organic material. I mean, relatively to the stirrup, there is a huge bibliography now. I can't. It's all very complicated. Let's just say that there were many systems in this early medieval cavalries to keep also the balance. We think about leather straps. To physically remain on the horseback. Even when the stirrup was pretty standard, we have evidence of knights literally getting themselves tied to the saddle, because the impacts of the charges were so violent that doesn't matter if they had a stirrup, they would still fly over their horse, we can say, in a very ruinous way. So it's also fascinating to see that aside from the metal things that archaeology can find, there were probably lots of other organic material devices that went corrupted with time and that haven't arrived to us. and that were probably extensively used to really increase the stability of the cavalryman on horseback. However, as we were saying, the one-hand grip was probably the most widespread still into the Byzantine cavalry at this time, just like in the Western world. So as we were saying before, the Western and Eastern cavalries at this time were kind of progressing in comparable fashion. One thing that is very interesting is that officers usually, but this is valid generally for, especially for the cataphract units proper, were wearing a flanged mace called in Greek bardukion, that is a sledgehammer, and that is very important because it's there's been a lot of speculations about this thing. Generally speaking, when you use a mace in this medieval context, but also in other times in history, you're essentially using that mace serves the purpose of breaking armor. So sometimes we've seen these maces issued, especially to officers and all, and we understand that aside from the functional use that it could have, because we know that also other cavalrymen had such a weapon, especially the cataphracts. This was more of a sort of a prestigious weapon, a symbolic thing. Think about even William the Conqueror using a mace in the Bayeux tapestry. The idea is that a guy with a mace is first of all fighting. It's not just fighting armored opponents, but it's probably an armored guy in itself, because the mace is short, so you necessarily have to approach the enemy at close range, and only armored troops can do that, because otherwise you would prefer a lance or even a sword to keep a bit of a distance with the enemy. So having a mace was probably only a functional thing. It was also a kind of a symbolic idea of power. In fact, there is this prejudice that stems, obviously, this idea of power stems chiefly from these eastern steppe populations that had a practically exclusively unarmored cavalry or archers, aside from the very elite that was usually made up by the ruling people, the ruling tribe that had subjugated the others, and that was usually fully armored, because those were the guys that had basically taken that could afford such an equipment, thanks to all the tributes that were being paid by other tribes. So this idea of wearing armor and keeping with mace and fighting against other armored opponents, it was a matter of prestige, and this was felt probably also in the West. And in fact, there is a prejudice also related to the idea of bishops that in the Western world used maces because of the allegedly moral reason that the clergy shouldn't shed blood. Well, telling you the truth, and especially in the Byzantine world, shedding blood was definitely a sin, and there were lots of penitences attached to killing, soldiers, especially in the Byzantine Empire. That was really felt more than in the West. But in the West, this idea of the bishop kept with mace because of that reason. We have evidence of that. We have evidence of bishops armed with maces, but we're not really sure it was just a moral thing. It might have been certain bishops were so prestigious that wearing a mace basically more than else equated to their political and social prestige that they definitely had, because they were princes in Western Europe. So I tend to read it in that fashion more than the idea that bishops didn't have to shed blood, so just causing internal trauma. By the way, you can shed blood also with a mace. So it kind of doesn't make sense, and this is a stereotype we should a bit resize in part. But it's interesting that this steppes tradition was there in Europe in the early Middle Ages as well, and that because this is something that we don't see much in the ancient world. Definitely, actually, training with club was pretty widespread in all armies. Even the Roman legionnaires trained themselves with clubs. It's also a physical thing. the Persians still have, by the way, a lot of club wielding traditions, and it's a typically feudal thing. It's the idea you have to smash from the above, which is typical of cavalry. So the Byzantines had absorbed this at the point that their officers were seemingly issued by standard this weapon. But I want to go further because let's pass to armor. So there were many types of armor this time. Sometimes we have pretty generic terms like the Loricion. These are all that would be the Lorica, the thorax, and the Zaba. The Zaba is actually an Arabic derived term, because the Byzantines also had their deal of Arab influence in military affairs and all. It comes from Zardafa. So the Zaba would be a sort of long mail coat. And the Lorician and the thorax could really be very, very standard names. These tagmatic troops, as we've said, were pretty heavily armored. Sometimes their armor would cover up to their knees and elbows. Armor could be either iron or even horn made. There were certain corselets, famously called the Klebanian, that were more sort of, they were usually sleeveless, but because they were made up in lamelle essentially, so they were this more rigid and especially good at fencing off arrows, armor that was pretty widespread in there. It was usually worn over the mail, so that was a very heavy extra protections, and that was what usually made you a cavalryman, a cataphract, and the you could wear that over the Lorician, and there was even sometimes certain padded coats that could be worn even both underneath and over the Lorician or the Klebanian. So a very big amount of protection, multi-layered, and that made of these troops really the very elite of the cavalry. And the head obviously was pretty much protected. Helmets, you had definitely iron helmets with mail hoods or aventails that covered therefore the whole face aside from the eyes. And it's also terrifying to see a guy, you can only see his face, his eyes, and the whole thing is armored. It's kind of a terrifying sight in part. And you can imagine vambraces and greaves could be made of iron, sometimes even of wood, or this is kind of, people ignore sometimes that there were certain wood armor. Especially in this period of early medieval times, into which material culture was definitely very poor, we have evidence of wood armor that was also pretty effective. Sometimes during the Gothic War in Italy, we have evidence of the Byzantines lacking armor, lacking metal, and therefore creating greaves or vambraces with wood, really. Sometimes even with hawk's hides. So something apparently can be very light, right? Because if you're hit straight in by an arrow or a sword, that's gonna cut beneath. But since most hits you're gonna take are not really direct, they really don't have a let's say a straight hit at 90 degrees. Much of the force can be deflected, and even leather and can be effective in some measure. And that's the reason why padded coats were worn, because already a padded coat. It was very thick in wool or linen and can't really deflect or absorb at least most hits, most cuts, most pierce. I mean, so that doesn't have to be underestimated. Needless to say, however, the most effective thing was usually the Clibanion with Lamellar Scales, and that's that was also very beautiful to see. Here we have, you can see here, well, not in detail, but these are all lamellae that were put together in iron. It was a pretty, and you can see here, in fact, the padded coat. The padded coat was sometimes called in Greek epi-lorikion, that is, means the lorica that stands over. But sometimes it could be worn. Talon-tree was usually worn beneath, but it could even be worn over. And this is interesting because sometimes it could avoid you to be recognized in the distance, because the armor can be shining and reflecting the sun scales and rays, and you might be spotted. So even wearing a padded coat over the armor might seem kind of useless, but it had also such an effect for problems of recognition and all. By the way, these things, as you can see here, were all colored. Sometimes there was also a lot of uniformity attached to this. So also in terms of recognition, etc., or for tactical identification, it was important. You have to think about these armies, medieval armies, to be extremely colorful. Even armor was painted sometimes. It's a very colored and colorful sight. So I talked extensively, and I will keep talking, by the way, about Byzantine armor in the videos already done. So if you're gonna want to look at it, there is in the Roman warfare and the Byzantine history playlist, you should find at least other 2 videos about Byzantine cataphracts, in which I discussed that. There are also other pictures that show you other variations of what I'm talking about. Relatively to the colorful nature of these gears, you have to think about crested helmets and even horsehair troughs. So a lot of nice decorations that were all the time, basically, in medieval times, and that also added a bit of majesty to the cavalryman appearance. Crests are usually also worn to look taller, some measure, and more frightening. The headgear, in this sense, is can have very strong psychological effects on the enemy. And by the way, at this time, that kind of went lost when, especially firearm technology in contemporary history made you was effective enough to shoot you with the smooth bore, essentially, this cocky attitude of wearing crests and all finishes, because before that the shots were quite imprecise, right? They could fly in the air, and therefore, even if you stood out as this thing with crest, if you were a commander, say, it was still useful for you to show up and to make yourself recognized, because that was a way to boost your troops' morale, and were relative risks regarding the chance of being hit. With the smooth bore rifles, basically, that ceases because the precision is so high you can be a sniper down, essentially. And so in these medieval times, being recognized was actually through crests and always very important, because there was a great pride attached to this and to these behaviors of being there on the field and in the midst of the melee and all, it was very important for the ethics and military ethics of those times, and therefore nobody cared if they risked to be killed just because they were recognized because of that, because that was the whole warfare was about, individually speaking. So the relative to the uniformity of colors, surely we know that there were certain favored colors. We're very far from the modern concept of standardization, but still there were certain colors that probably were issued, or at least for reasons of esprit de corps, or even for psychological effects, because seeing a whole unit actually marching ordered and silently and all in one color, or at least in similar colors, it adds up to the to the fear that it can spread before it. So we have to think about these troops maybe being given, even by the state, certain amount of cloth from which they eventually would have had to make to work their clothes with, but having maybe some similar colors. So we find sometimes red, especially also purple, were a bit the symbol of the empire, generally speaking, and the red is it can conceal blood spurts on it, so it's kind of, it has some functionality, but there were many shades also of blue, of green, of yellow as well, so kind of varied after all, and there were definitely certain decorations like embroideries at hems and cuffs, for instance, to have been decorated in gold. Gold was also another color of the empire in some measure because of its say symbolisms, also religious ones and all. And these guys were wearing definitely boots that seemingly were decorated also in a certain fashion that probably had to do partly with some uniformity with that. Definitely were cloaks being worn as any soldier in history, I believe, because of being protected from cold or even heat sometimes, and there are certain usually isolating materials that you have to think that the Byzantines at this time were fighting in a very wide range of environments in terms of, I mean, the Balkanic mountains are not that warm, nor, while definitely the Anatolian deserts can be really hot. So a lot of temperature excursions, and then you have to be kept accordingly. Cloaks were usually not worn in battle because they could be actually, especially in formation, they could cause problems. But I mean, cloaks can be also used effectively in single combat in order to be used as a sort of defense. If you don't have a shield, you can do something with a cloak, actually. If you look at the modern warfare with cloak and dagger fencing, you can figure about swashbuckling and all this stuff. It's a thing. But if you're fighting like at this times into, especially in formation, the cloak can also be. And by the way, that's physically speaking. Think of, I mean, fighting under the sun. Obviously, you don't want a cloak on, because you're already overloaded with padded coats, armor that gets think of all the heat that accumulates. I mean, physically speaking, such battle experiences could have been, especially because of armor, something devastating. In fact, combats were usually pretty short. They just lasted 2 or 3 minutes at the longest, and then they had to let's say to draw back, and then to do that over and over again, because the physical performance was devastating, really, for an organism. Like, think of all the tension, the adrenaline pumping. I mean, it's really a very violent thing to go through. So and naturally, by the way, there was I forgot to say that these tagmata were actually subdivided into a unit called bandon in Greek, that comes from that was used also in Latin as bandus or bandum, that is from the term from which banner actually comes from. It's an ensign, It corresponds in this sense to the unit. It actually has a Germanic origin, more specifically Gothic, bandvo, that the Byzantines had got since the 4th century when they used the Goths as federati. And by the way, this is interesting to see. It's interesting to see how partly the even the Byzantine language had been partly Germanized in certain military things, because definitely the Germanic military influence had an impact also. You can see these Germanic derived terms were used there all around. So the bandon was present both in tagmatic and thematic units, seemingly, and it was usually led by a count, comes, and it was usually 200, 400 strong if infantry, and or 50, 100 strong, roughly. But these are theoretical numbers. But you understand, it's and there were other subdivisions, etc. But let's say that each one, because of this name, had its own banner, corresponded to the bandon. So you have to think about these lance pennons, plumes, shields and standards that probably were issued with a particular color or symbolism that was attached to the bandon symbol. That's what this Predecorp is practically based on. In fact, you have to think that more than the whole army, these guys were mostly attached to their own smaller units, usually company size, like it's always been. That the base to which soldiers are more attached. Relatively to we can say, obviously, there was probably some distinction between the heavy lance cavalry and the archers, because the first were probably more heavily armored, while the archers probably were just coat of mail. I mean, they had to be more agile, because that was their tactical need to run back and forth, shooting arrows, and they probably also mounted faster horses, lighter horses, and they were not really meant to come close hand with the enemy. It could happen, so the Byzantine horse archers were definitely trained also for that. They were pretty more multi-role, multitask, and the Byzantines cared very much about this specialization in terms of tactical flexibility and all. But generally speaking, these tactical specializations were kind of also needed, so that was probably the main difference. These, at least all the lancers, rode probably armored or half-armored horses, while the archers, in fact, probably didn't. Yeah, and one strange thing is, I believe, though, it's a lack of sources, is that the Byzantines didn't really seem to have made use of spores. That is strange, actually, at this time at least. I believe they still used it. It's simply that maybe they weren't shown into to iconographical sources. I know that there are certain archaeological finds, and I don't know about spores. I just read it, so I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you know it better than me. And there were lots of other weapons. Actually, you have to think the great part of this. I mean, we're talking about an elite unit, right? But even these elite units could be engaged into very, normally the elite unit is meant for the great pitched battle that the Byzantines were essentially creating, even with the cataphracts. This very ultra elite units that basically equated to the might of the empire, and were meant to basically field a unit that couldn't be countered in open field by their enemies. There was also a lot of ideological meanings attached to this, because obviously the empire was something very different from the other populations that existed at the time. It was a state. It has this glorious military tradition of Rome and all. So they had kind of to show and they had resources for affording such show-offs. But especially these tagmatic units, as elite as they could be, they however carried out also other tactical tasks. And actually most of warfare is made up of skirmishes, of minor operations. In order to make these units more flexible, you also have to add to the missile capability of them, because that's very vital. Also because the enemies the Byzantines were facing were sometimes also very they had a great missile potential as well. So the Byzantines at this time could have the tagmatic cavalry could have even javelins. Even the Contarians sometimes could be substituted with these javelins, but I think that every knight more or less could make use of these weapons. And even the old Mazio Barbuloi, that is or plumbate, these basically small darts were thrown handily at the enemy, and this added up even to the potential and defensive the potential let's say the offensive and defensive potential of the Byzantine cavalry. And what is fascinating, as I was saying before, is how these fighters were basically trained to use every kind of weapon. This is very fascinating. It could really pass from a to a weapon to another, from a weapon to another, and they were probably very dynamic to this. I mean, I'm sure even the shields could be used. I mean, surely part of this tagmatic cataphracts could maybe put the shields on their backs, and from their saddle quiver they could take out an arrow and shoot with their bow that they carried somewhere else. I mean, the whole thing was very dynamic, and this is actually something you can see also in the Western cavalry. That is often, there is this idea that, I don't know, that unit has to do only that. But especially at this time, these professional troops that were paid or that fought for a living, essentially. It doesn't matter whether they were paid by the state, like in the Byzantine Empire, or whether they had a fief from which they could draw the needed resources from it, like in the Frankish world. I mean, these troops spent their lives fighting, and that wouldn't necessarily qualify them to use all weapons, because they were trained constantly to use them. So that is something really basic for these guys in terms of combat standards. Okay, for now I think we can finish this, so I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.